The gospel reading this morning is from the 16th chapter of the Gospel according to Luke. We're picking up the narrative in verse 19. This is a familiar parable to many people. It's usually called the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Lazarus is a common name in New Testament times. This particular Lazarus is not the same Lazarus that we encounter in the Gospel of John, the Lazarus who was the brother of Mary and Martha, the Lazarus whom Jesus resurrects from the dead. This is a different Lazarus, and in the Hebrew Bible, Lazarus is the name Eliezer. And the way we should think of this story is that, like the Jonah story that we heard last week, this too is a folk tale. It's a morality play. And it's set in the afterlife, at least part of the story, but it's not really about that. It's about the here and now. So with that in mind, let us listen for God's word. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us, a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." He said then, "Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." He said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." He said to him, If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." This is the word of the Lord. Rich man, poor man. Sermon of my title this morning, those of you of a certain age will recall that there was a miniseries back in the 70s of the same title, and I won't bore you with rather the plot of that, but if you're interested, Google it this morning. It'll bring back some fond memories. This week I was reading in the Naples News that our community here currently has listed the most expensive house in the nation. $285 million. I have no idea where it is. You can tell me after church. You probably know where it is. But as you know, we live in a society that has a broad diversity of income levels. There's a yawning gap between rich and poor, which has been growing larger in recent decades. I live out east of here on Davis Boulevard, and there is not a day that I come to church that I do not see homeless people on Davis Boulevard, usually pushing a cart. There is a Seventh-day Adventist church on Davis Boulevard that distributes food at 4 o'clock every Saturday. They do it by you drive up and they load your car, and there is always a line that reaches out into the street. So the demand is quite high. I want you to think about these things in terms of this story. More than a decade ago, a new religious statue was installed in the town of Davidson, North Carolina. And this particular statue is unlike anything that you would usually see in a church. The statue depicts Jesus as a vagrant sleeping on a park bench. St. Albans Episcopal Church installed the homeless Jesus statue on its property in the middle of an upscale neighborhood filled with well-kept townhouses and upscale houses. The statue looks like this if you haven't seen this. Jesus is huddled under a blanket with his face and hands obscured, and only the crucifixion wounds on his uncovered feet give him away. Well, as you can imagine, the reaction was immediate. Some loved it, some didn't. One woman from the neighborhood actually called the police the first time that she drove by. She thought it was literally a homeless person sleeping on a park bench. She called the police. She called the cops on Jesus. Another neighbor who lives a couple of doors down from the church wrote a letter to the editor of the local newspaper saying it creeps him out. Some neighbors felt at the time that it's an insulting depiction of the Son of God, and that what appears to be a hobo curled up on a bench demeans the neighborhood. Well, full disclosure, Gail and I lived a block from that church and that statue when I served the Davidson College Presbyterian Church. It was the same neighborhood that we lived in, and so we were able to witness all of this sort of play out. The bronze statue was purchased for $22,000 as a memorial for a parishioner. Her name was Kate McIntyre, and she loved public art. She had many gifts to the community that were positioned throughout the city. The rector of this friendly, inclusive congregation at the time was a man named the Reverend David Buck. He was 65 years old at the time, just like me. He was getting ready to retire. He was a Baptist turned Episcopalian who seemed not to be at all averse to the controversy, the double takes, the discussion that the statue provoked. This is what he said at the time: "It gives authenticity to our church. This is an affluent church, to be honest, and we need to be reminded ourselves that our faith expresses itself in active concern for the marginalized in our society." The sculpture is intended as a visual translation of the passage in the book of Matthew in which Jesus tells his disciples, "As you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me." Moreover, Buck said, it's a good Bible lesson for those who are used to seeing Jesus depicted in traditional religious art as the Christ of glory enthroned in finery. We believe that that's the kind of life that Jesus led, Buck said. He was, in essence, a homeless person. Well, this lakeside college town just north of Charlotte had the first Jesus the Homeless statue on display in the United States, but since then it's been displayed in various locations worldwide, with over 50 copies created and placed in cities such as Rome, London, Dublin, and Washington, D.C., plus many more. The creator is a Canadian sculptor, a devout Catholic named Timothy Schmalz, and from his studio in Ontario, Canada, Schmalz said he understands that his Jesus the Homeless is provocative. It's meant to be. That's essentially what the sculpture is there to do, he said. It's meant to challenge people. Back at St. Albans in Davidson, the rector reported that the Jesus the Homeless statue has earned more followers than detractors over the years. It's now common, he said, to see people come and sit on the bench and rest their hand on the bronze feet and pray. Now, I share this with you because the Jesus the homeless statue, I think, challenges us in exactly the same way that today's parable from Luke challenges us, the rich man and Lazarus. These verses of Luke contain vivid details, from the sore-licking dogs to the dialogue between the rich man and Abraham. We can hear the rich man's clamor for a drop of water, his begging for a merciful messenger to his brothers. We can see the bone-clinging flesh of Lazarus, the sores that never healed. I think we're meant to flinch when we read or hear these verses. I'm wondering today, what makes you cringe the most when you hear these words? Is it the image of the man in need, or Abraham's words that during your lifetime you received your good things, and in equal measure Lazarus in the same manner his evil things? Do you shudder at the hopelessness of the assertion that neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead? You know, the conventional interpretation of this story sees it as a tale of heaven and hell, a warning to make the right choices now so that you'll end up on the good side of the divide. But Jesus doesn't intend for this to be some literal explanation of what happens after we die. Instead, this over-the-top story was told to spur us into action in this life. This parable, then, isn't about heaven and hell. It's about here and now. You see, some stories are outrageous exaggerations in order to make an opposite point. Perhaps the great chasm the parable speaks of isn't really an unbridgeable gap between heaven and hell in the afterworld. Rather, the chasm that Jesus is pointing out is one right here. The chasm between rich and poor, the chasm between the privileged and the poor. And that chasm can be overcome. Indeed, one can cross over a chasm. We can build a bridge. We often talk about building bridges between divides, and we don't just talk about that, we do it all the time. In fact, bridges are pretty miraculous structures if you think about them. They make for shortcuts. They connect what was separated. They provide for safe passage over dangerous terrain, and they make great metaphors, especially for sermons. We talk of bridging divides between people and cultures, classes and conflicts. Bridges make things possible that were impossible. Although the action of the parable is set in an imaginary afterlife, the chasm could have been bridged, according to the story, in this life. The rich man could have reached out to Lazarus, the starving man at his gate. Clearly, Lazarus had reached out to him, begging for food, wanting just some scraps, anything, but nothing happened in return. No hand reached back. No food was shared. A poor man can't build a bridge by himself. The reciprocal responsibility fell to the rich man. Some empathy at least, a little food, a coin tossed in his bowl? No. The rich man ignored Lazarus in favor of his own pleasures. He might not have even noticed him. If he did, he probably thanked God that he wasn't the man with the bleeding sores at his feet. And so in the story, the chasm widened. No bridge was built. The parable, however, isn't ultimately about two particular men, one in heaven and the other in hell and how they got there. Rather, they stand for larger characters, whole classes or communities of the poor and the rich. It speaks to the barriers and boundaries we erect between poverty and plenty. The parable is about the chasms we live with and that we ignore. It's about us and the fissures of injustice we walk past every day. The good news, however, for us is that there are many people who are building bridges throughout our society and throughout our world, people who are reaching out, and I'd like to share with you just one example this morning. Her name is Mackenzie Scott. Mackenzie Scott, who was raised in a Presbyterian home. In a world where billionaire philanthropy is often characterized by grand, self-named foundations and tightly controlled grants, Mackenzie Scott has emerged as a revolutionary force. Since her 2019 divorce from Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, Scott has embarked on an unprecedented philanthropic mission, giving away more than $16 billion to over 1,900 nonprofit organizations at a breathtaking pace. Her strategy, executed with a large team of advisors, fundamentally challenges the traditional top-down approach to giving by providing massive unrestricted grants to organizations, primarily those focused on advancing equity and empowering underserved communities, thereby rewriting the rules of how wealth can be used to foster systemic change. And at the heart of Scott's approach is a concept called trust-based philanthropy. Trust-based philanthropy. This model operates on a simple yet profound premise. The leaders of nonprofit organizations, especially those with lived experience in communities that they serve, are really the true experts on how to solve local problems. Therefore, they should be trusted with capital without onerous restrictions. Unlike conventional philanthropy, which often involves lengthy grant applications and specific project funding and burdensome reporting requirements, Scott's gifts are no strings attached. Organizations receive a call, often unexpectedly informing them of a multi-million-dollar donation that they can use for any purpose they deem necessary, from covering conventional operation costs like salaries and rent to scaling up successful programs, or even building an endowment for long-term stability. This method has transformative effect. It frees up invaluable time and resources that nonprofits would otherwise spend on fundraising and grant compliance. Instead, they can focus entirely on their core mission, allowing them to be more agile, innovative, and responsive to the needs of their constituents. The traditional philanthropic model, while well-intentioned, can inadvertently create a power imbalance. Wealthy donors and large foundations often dictate the terms of their funding, forcing nonprofits to align their programs with the donor's vision rather than the community's actual needs. And Scott's model inverts this dynamic. By ceding control, she empowers organizations to invest in their own infrastructure, experiment with new ideas, and plan for the future. For many smaller grassroots organizations, particularly those led by women and people of color who've been historically underfunded, a gift from Scott is not just a donation, it's a powerful vote of confidence and a lifeline to sustainability. For example, her donations have provided massive boosts to historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs, tribal colleges, community development, financial institutions that serve low-income neighborhoods. And these are not just charitable acts, they are strategic investments in the infrastructure of social mobility and economic justice. But let us also be clear that even the best charitable practices are not a substitute for sound public policy. Friends, the parable this week reminds us that this is not a new divide between those who have and those who have not. And I'm torn between being thankful for this reminder and feeling absolutely exhausted that nothing has changed, seemingly in forever. I don't know where you are with money. I don't know if it's your friend or your enemy. On any given day in my life, it plays both roles. And ultimately, it's not money itself, but rather the love of it, as we read in 1 Timothy. It's the obsession with obtaining more and more and more that troubles our hearts and causes so much pain. Our rich man in the gospel ends up where he does because of how he treats another fellow human being, not because of his bank balance. But that doesn't excuse us from examining our relationship with money, particularly as many of us stare down the stewardship season. And so I'll close this morning by asking you a few more questions. Can we imagine a society, a world, that embraces Lazarus? In the parable, Lazarus could have saved the rich man when both were alive, if only the rich man had reached for the poor man's hand. And that is the story's central truth. The only way of healing is together.